Today's outing is going to be different than usual, a lot different. Let me start by summarizing the story for you. Our team is out searching for Stargates on worlds that aren't being used by people because Samantha Carter and McKay have this clever idea for a way to unite the two galaxies. Those Stargates in each one can all be dialed from anywhere within their galaxy by a normal power source, not needing a ZPM in order to span the galaxies. What they plan to do is take a bunch of them in Pegasus and a bunch of them in the Milky Way and have them bridge the gap between the galaxies with a station in between to cross over from one galaxy's network to another. Of course, that means getting gates without screwing other people over, which is what brings us to this planet, the first that they're checking over, where there's a simple little village. Our heroes quickly discover that the whole town is practically worshipping this guy named Lucius, played by Richard Kind, who was in the original Stargate film actually, though obviously not playing this part. The character seems to be anything but appealing, but the villagers hang on his every word, and he has 6 gorgeous wives, including Willa, played by future regular of Stargate universe, Julia Benson. Lucius claims to have great things to trade to Atlantis, so Dr. Beckett is sent, skeptical naturally. Eventually, though, he returns with Lucius, convinced this guy is the greatest thing since sliced haggis. Dr. Weir is upset that he broke protocol doing that, and her mood is not helped by Lucius openly and obviously glaring at her boobs every time they meet. It's all she can do to remain professional dealing with this representative of their civilization, but does so at Beckett's insistence that it will do a great deal for Atlantis. Next thing Rodney and Shepard discover, returning from a mission, is that everyone is as enamored with Lucius on Atlantis as the villagers were, and they can't understand it. So Rodney starts investigating and discovers Lucius is drinking something from a vial, while Shepard is trying to convince Dr. Weir not to send a team to a planet that Lucius says will help them, but Intel says is home to multiple Wraith Hive ships. Shepard returns to the village only to find they're all miserable and pleading for Lucius to come back. They're not just down that he's gone, they look physically ill. When he returns, Rodney is now part of this little cult of Lucius, and Shepard finds himself the last sane man here, as he's the only one outraged that Beckett led Ronan and Taylor to that Wraith planet in order to gather herbs for Lucius, and were shockingly lucky not to have been killed. So in desperation, Shepard kidnaps Carson and steals Rodney's notes on what Lucius had, to reveal that the liquid he's drinking is a drug taken from those herbs that causes the one who drinks it to release pheromones, which interact with the pleasure center of the brain, and thus influence their behavior, somewhat like the episode The Game of Star Trek The Next Generation. It doesn't affect Shepard because he's sick and is congested, plus the fact that he hasn't been around the guy long means that he hasn't breathed in enough in order to be affected. Beckett is having a hard time buying that, but Shepard insists that he analyzed the data objectively. But next thing we know, the rest of Shepard's team tags him and brings him and Beckett back, where Shepard is locked in a cell and Lucius gloats over this, that the most unpopular guy in the village is beloved now and has 6 gorgeous wives who have been known to have sex with him all at the same time. And thank you for that mental image, Atlantis. Lucius wants to be able to use the gene therapy that Carson developed so that he can fly jumpers. He thinks that's really cool. So Beckett hooks him up, but it's a trick. It's an agent to block the release of the pheromones while Shepard flies him someplace else until Beckett can put together something to make the Atlantis team immune to it, in time to stop Dr. Weir from becoming wife number 7. Beckett succeeds, the expedition is saved, the villagers are all cured, and Lucius is sent back to his people. The end. The reason I plowed through the episode that way is that this episode brings up issues that I have touched on, but I feel I need that space to properly address, especially at this point in talking about the series. To get this out of the way first, though, Richard Kind is a great performer, and I have to admit he does an admirable job here. Kind is the kind of actor whom you expect to play the loser. He's heavy set. In fact, the episode was originally referred to as Delicious Fat Man. He's not conventionally handsome by any means, and his voice has an airy, whiny tone to it. He's turned that into countless roles that he performs quite well, and strictly speaking as a performer, he really couldn't have done better with this episode. His body language is that of someone who is used to having his way, and he positions himself in such a way that the pheromones he gives off will be more concentrated for the person that he's speaking to, little things like that. When he speaks with Shepard in private, there's an atmosphere about him, with all the pretense gone, that says basically, everyone used to hate me, but I've shown them. Now they love me. And after all the mistreatment I've suffered, don't I deserve that? It's the loser feeling that he's finally won the day, and believes that, really, he's not doing anything wrong. The regulars as well perform the episode quite well. Their exaggerated behavior, thanks to the influence of Lucius, could be amusing, depending on your viewpoint. And there's a little of the human banter in there, like Rodney and Shepard discussing which Catwoman was which of the old Batman show, on the remark about Shepard's hair, Shepard hitting the whining Beckett in the chest telling him to buck up. There are moments like that I'd say are positives in this episode. I don't dislike Atlantis. I want to make that clear. I don't even dislike the characters, although I have found them frustrating at times. And Atlantis made some smart moves. One season of being isolated and then ending that was a bold move, but avoided that situation leading to stagnation as it has done with others. Changing that status quo and setting new goals for our heroes was a good move. Swapping out Ford for Ronan, I've already discussed what an improvement that was for the show by altering the team dynamic. Actions frequently have consequences here, much like on SG-1. There's a lot of positive things to say about Atlantis. But that being said, Atlantis has the problem of being frequently myopic. They would often have questionable things happen and either not notice or just justify them. Now, having to make a tough moral choice, I understand that. The issue, for instance, with Michael, where you have to consider whether what they did was right or wrong. Even they're not certain about that, and there's a great deal of room to decide for yourselves with that. But other times, they're possessing of a moral certitude that is highly questionable, if not downright terrifying. The goal is no doubt to demonstrate our heroes' passion, loyalty, commitment, and so on. But as presented, they wind up looking like self-absorbed assholes, if not outright monsters. Sometimes the hero might feel they have no choice but to resort to the tactics of a villain. But even when they do, a hero shouldn't rationalize it away. A hero, if they cross the line, should bear the burden of their sin, or else they're just villains in a different uniform. But what does that have to do with a comedy episode like Irresistible? Well, because it's another example of this myopic way of thinking, of not really realizing what exactly you're doing here. And that's part of the reason why I really couldn't enjoy this episode. It's the same reason that despite its popularity, I couldn't enjoy Duet. Some people, and I don't mean this as an insult, but based upon what they say, this basically describes what they're doing. Some people sit down and simply turn their brains off when they watch. If something is a comedy, then it's a comedy and nothing serious is going on as far as they're concerned. Now, personally, I can't do that. To me, it's like watching a football game and doing nothing but reacting to each play as it happens. To me, you watch every play in the context of the larger game and also in the context of the season. Was the pass incomplete because the quarterback failed to connect, or the receiver not being in position, or the blockers failing to keep pressure off, or something else? Everything else contributes to the interpretation of what you're seeing, and this can be hashed out after the fact, but is also going to be understood on a gut level on a moment-by-moment basis. So an episode like Duet, which I understand is popular to others, nevertheless rubs me the wrong way because it treats the equivalent of being controlled by a Goa'uld, something that the franchise explained was a fate worse than death, as comedy. Which likewise brings up Irresistible. Mind control is a lot like radiation. A little might not be harmful, and might even do some good. But too much and things are going to go very wrong in your story. Mind control attacks our most fundamental part, our control over our own self, our thoughts, our actions, our desires. If you're going to play with that, you have to handle that radiation carefully, which this episode doesn't. The most notable aspect of it all, and there are other things in here too, but the most notable being the fact that Lucius is raping women in a comedy episode. Now yes, he's the villain, so it's not as if the episode is endorsing his behavior directly. The problem with this, though, is that when you have a light-hearted comedy, it has to be, well, light-hearted. And it may surprise you to learn that that's not really an attitude a lot of people have towards rape. And since so many people when this episode came out were confused by this, let's be clear. When you drug someone, which Lucius was doing via his pheromones, so that they can no longer give informed consent, that is the definition of rape. In fact, we had talked about covering this episode months ago, the requester and I, but I was hesitant to do a date rape episode because it was right in the midst of all the publicity around Bill Cosby's arrest. That part is important because lighthearted comedy means, in the end, everything's in good fun. It's the opposite, naturally, of dark comedy, which doesn't have a "that wasn't an intention" defense. It knows precisely what it's doing and makes that point obvious to you. The comedy comes, at least in part, from the fact that it is deliberately and knowingly crossing the line of good taste. Irresistible stumbles over that line like a drunken imbecile, completely oblivious to that, despite repeatedly doing everything short of saying the word rape. Willa comes out and says that she refused to sleep with Lucius many times before, but then when he used the pheromones on her, she did a complete 180. With Shepard in his cell, Lucius gloats about his orgy with them all. Not to mention all the staring at Weir's boobs and coming on to Taylor. Someone defended this by saying you can't overanalyze anything, but it's not overanalyzing if it removes all subtext and dangles it all out in front of you, while the director is saying, we never intended it that way, so people shouldn't interpret it as meaning that. Speaking as a comedian, not that you would know from today's review, obviously, sometimes you do step over the line, on purpose or otherwise. The maxim I've learned to stick with was that step worth it? For every joke that crossed the line I've done, I've had 10 come to mind that I never did. That's why some of my earliest stuff is probably my most offensive material, but I digress. Point is, when you cross that line, there was always going to be some degree of blowback. And I have received it over women captains, race issues, immigration, LGBTQ, homelessness, monarchies, the moon landing hoax, alien visitations, and Rob Liefeld. So let me just say that 99 times out of 100, the worst thing you can say when this happens is, lighten up. Leaving that aside, though, and I must admit there are shows where I have had to deliberately turn a blind eye to something because aside of that one horrible thing, everything else was just so wonderful. I'll be getting to that later this year, in fact. But leaving that aside, this episode really isn't impressive as a comedy. It's far too repetitive, an irony given how great SG-1's window of opportunity was earlier this month, which was all about repetition. Irresistible keeps hitting the same notes and thinks that it's making a symphony when it's just an advertising jingle. Stretching the premise out to fill in a 1-hour show hurts it tremendously. Taking the window of opportunity example, it's serious, then it's a comedy, then it's serious again. Result? One of the favorite episodes amongst fans. This episode could have gone similarly. Start with Shepard in his cell to establish Lucius, and thus the focus of the episode, but then flash back to a mission event that occupies the first third or so of the episode. Bring Lucius's plot into it, use the now forgotten original mission to bring in a plot device to thwart Lucius in the end. You've now condensed his comedy part down so that it doesn't overstay its welcome. And you kept the rest of the episode from serving as filler to get to his plot. And I would strongly advise changing his ability a little bit. Make him unaware that he's doing it so that he's not a malicious villain. He's a villain who doesn't understand why one day everyone started liking him. And hey, that's not that far of a stretch when you remember that the Wraith are shown to be capable of having influence over human minds, and thus be able to sci-fi a way to provide a subconscious form of that to our oblivious character. But again, that's just my take on it, and I'm just a viewer with an opinion.
All hail the Overlord! All hail the Overlord!
Now, what about Beckett?
Oh, he can walk on his hands. Did you know that? Yeah, he was showing Lucius just before he left. You should have seen it. He was down on his hands.